They called me useless, laughed at my dreams, said I'd never be more than a burden. Even my own mother didn't believe in me. But while they mocked me, I was building quietly, relentlessly. And when I finally rose, I didn't just succeed. I shattered every label they gave me. This is the story of how the boy no one believed in became the youngest billionaire CEO. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe for more real stories of resilience, revenge, and rising above. Now, let's dive in. Growing up in a house where your worth is measured by how well you fit the mold is a quiet kind of torment. My mother had dreams once. At least, that's what she told people. But life hardened her early, and somewhere between unpaid bills and an absent husband, she forgot how to believe in anything that didn't already have a paycheck attached to it. So when I started talking about wanting to build something of my own, something that didn't involve a traditional job or a college diploma, she didn't just disagree, she laughed. The kind of laugh that cuts deeper than any insult, because it comes from someone who's supposed to love you no matter what. You, she said, eyebrows raised and voice sharp. You can't even fold your own laundry. What makes you think you'll ever be more than a burden? That word, burden, became the background noise of my teenage years. She'd say it when I burned dinner trying to cook for myself. She'd say it when I came home late from the library. She even said it when I brought home a science fair medal, claiming I must have copied someone else's work. My ideas didn't fit the blueprint of the life she wanted for me. College, job, marriage, stability. Safe. Predictable. That was success in her eyes. And anything outside that path? It wasn't just risky, it was worthless. She couldn't see value in ambition unless it had a diploma or paycheck attached. So every time I sketched an app idea, every time I watched startup videos while others were sleeping, I kept it to myself. I learned to dream silently, in the spaces between her disapproval. At 16, I brought her a prototype I'd been working on. A simple concept, rough around the edges, but mine. I expected criticism, sure, but I still hoped for a flicker of curiosity. Instead, she stared at the paper, expression blank, before sighing heavily and tearing it in half. "Grow up," she muttered. "This isn't a cartoon. Nobody cares about your little projects." That moment didn't just break my heart, it hardened it. From then on, I stopped trying to earn her approval. I stopped bringing her my dreams, stopped hoping she'd see me. I buried the hurt and let her believe I was lazy, delusional, even useless. Because trying and failing in her eyes hurt more than being invisible. But I never stopped building. Every rejection became fuel. I stayed up till 3 a.m. teaching myself how to code using a cracked screen phone and public Wi-Fi. I got my hands on every free course I could find, entered online competitions under fake names, and studied the lives of those who had once been laughed at, just like me. I started selling small programs on freelancer sites, each one better than the last. By 18, I had made enough to move out, not to a fancy place, just a studio above a laundromat, but it was mine. No more tiptoeing past her judgment. No more silencing my ideas. I didn't even tell her I left. I just vanished from her day-to-day, like I never existed. It took 3 years of brutal nights and unforgiving markets to get my first real break. A mid-sized investor noticed one of my tools during a product demo. He asked for a meeting. I walked into that boardroom in a second-hand suit, stomach twisting, knowing I had everything to prove and nothing to lose. That day, I didn't just pitch a product. I poured out every hour of lost sleep, every ignored idea, every time I was called useless. And they listened. They invested. One product turned into 2. One investor turned into 5. And just like that, my startup wasn't just an idea, it was a company. By 23, I had employees, partners, and more media attention than I ever thought I'd want. I didn't post about it. I didn't call my mother. I didn't send her money or news articles. I let her keep believing whatever she needed to believe. But deep down, a part of me was waiting. Not for her apology, I knew better than that, but for the chance to be seen, truly seen. The kind of moment where the truth couldn't be ignored or rewritten. And that moment came on a gray Saturday, when the family held a reunion I hadn't attended in years. I almost didn't go, but something told me it was time. I arrived late, wearing jeans and a hoodie, nothing flashy. She barely acknowledged me when I walked in. She was too busy showing off photos of my cousins, one a nurse, one an accountant, one engaged to a man in finance. And this one, she said, nodding toward me without making eye contact, still chasing his little dreams. Maybe one day he'll wake up. The room laughed, and for a second, I felt 17 again, small, humiliated, disposable. But then I reached into my backpack, pulled out a framed front page of Forbes magazine, and gently placed it on the table. The laughter died instantly. I turned toward the photo, me in a sharp suit, standing in front of my company's logo, the headline reading, "Youngest Billionaire CEO Disrupts the Industry with AI Innovation." I watched my mother's eyes move from the headline to my face, searching for a punchline. But there was none. Just me, standing in the skin she always called a failure. Except now, it wasn't failure, it was power. It was proof. I wasn't chasing dreams, I said calmly. I was building them. You just never looked long enough to see. She didn't say a word. Not then. Not after. Success looks beautiful from a distance. It glitters under stage lights, smiles in photo ops, and drapes itself in designer fabric. But no one ever sees what it demands in private. No one talks about the weight that comes with proving yourself, especially when your whole life was spent being dismissed. After that family reunion, word spread fast. Suddenly, people who hadn't messaged me in years started reaching out. Cousins who once ignored me were sharing my story like we were best friends. My aunt even told the neighborhood that she always knew I had it in me. But it was all noise. Shallow echoes of praise from people who only saw value once it had a price tag. None of them had ever asked how I got there. None of them cared about the nights I slept on a folded blanket beside my workstation, or the times I skipped meals just to save enough to run a server for one more week. The night after the reunion, I sat alone in my penthouse. Not because I didn't have friends, but because I didn't know who was real anymore. When I was invisible, I had silence. Now that I was seen, I had noise. Everyone wanted a piece of the success, but no one wanted to understand the cost. I poured myself a glass of water and looked out over the city skyline, each glowing window representing someone else's life. Somewhere out there, I imagined, was a kid just like I had been, watching the world from behind cracked glass, dreaming something bigger while everyone laughed at him. I wanted to reach that kid. I wanted to tell him that the pain he was swallowing would one day become fuel. But even if I could, I knew he'd have to walk the fire alone, just like I did. It wasn't just strangers who came out of the shadows after the news. My mother called 2 days after the reunion. I recognized the number immediately and nearly let it ring out. But something in me wanted to hear her voice, maybe hoping it would sound different this time. It didn't. "You've been busy," she said, her voice too sweet, too calm, like she was trying on kindness for the first time. I stayed silent, waiting. "I just wanted to say congratulations," she added. "We're all very proud of you." We. As if she had ever been part of the journey. As if pride was something she had earned the right to feel. I almost laughed, but I didn't. I thanked her, politely, and ended the call. There was nothing left to say. What she didn't know was that even with all the wealth, the titles, the awards, I still carried her words inside me. That label, useless, had etched itself deep into my self-worth. There were days I stood in boardrooms, surrounded by investors and advisors, and still felt like that same boy with ink-stained fingers and an empty lunchbox. Imposter syndrome, they called it. But I knew better. It wasn't just about success. It was about surviving years of being unloved, uncelebrated, and unheard. When a child grows up without affirmation, even victory feels suspicious. I had to teach myself how to accept praise, how to believe that I deserve the life I built. I hired a therapist, one of the best in the country. Every Tuesday, I sat across from her and tried to unlearn the version of myself I'd been taught to believe in. I told her about the time I overheard my mother say she regretted having me. I told her about the way I used to fake illnesses to avoid family gatherings. I told her how, even after making my first million, I slept on the floor because beds felt like luxury I hadn't earned. She listened, patiently, and for the first time in my life, someone looked at me with empathy rather than expectation. It helped. Not overnight, but slowly. The company grew faster than I expected. We expanded to 5 countries within 2 years. I sat on panels, gave keynote speeches, and launched scholarship programs in neighborhoods like the one I grew up in. But the more I gave away, the more people expected. I was no longer the underdog. I was the benchmark. Every success came with critics. Every mistake came with headlines. Some days I missed the invisibility. I missed building in the dark, where failure wasn't public and no one cared if I messed up. But I reminded myself why I started, not for fame, not even for money, but to prove that I was not what they said I was. One afternoon, I got a message that made me freeze. It was from a former classmate, someone who once tripped me in the hallway and called me Robot Boy because I didn't talk much. His message said, "Hey man, saw your feature on Forbes. Crazy stuff. I've got this startup idea, and I'd love to hop on a call if you have a few minutes." I stared at the message for a long time, thinking about how easy it was for people to rewrite history when the outcome benefits them. I didn't reply. Some doors are better left closed. I learned something crucial in those years. Success doesn't heal all wounds. It just puts them under brighter light. If you're not careful, you start to think that money makes you whole. But it doesn't. Not if you're still haunted by the people who broke you. Not if you're still trying to prove something to someone who never cared to understand you in the first place. That was the cost, giving pieces of myself to a world that only applauded after it was safe to do so. One night, I found myself sitting in that same laundromat where I used to live. The building hadn't changed much. Paint peeling, the hum of old machines, the scent of detergent and weariness. I sat in silence, letting the memories wash over me. The hunger, the solitude, the stubborn hope. And for the first time in years, I let the tears fall. Not because I was sad, but because I finally understood. I didn't succeed in spite of the pain. I succeeded because of it. There are some wounds that never scab over. They don't bleed, but they sting quietly, persistently, like an echo that won't fade. I thought success would drown that echo out, but if anything, it made the silence around it louder. My mother never apologized. Not when she saw my face on magazine covers. Not when reporters asked about my upbringing and I paused, carefully dodging the question. Not even after she showed up to one of my charity events, uninvited, smiling like she had been cheering me on all along. She stood in the front row as if the applause belonged to her too. I saw her from the stage, pretending not to. The event was for underprivileged youth in tech, kids who looked just like I once did, eyes wide with possibility, desperate for someone to believe in them. As I spoke, I could feel her presence like a weight pressing against my ribcage. Her gaze followed me the whole time, but when I finished, I slipped out the back. I couldn't face her. Not then. Maybe not ever. Because facing her meant reopening everything I had tried to bury. And I was afraid of what might come out if I let myself go there. But the thing about pain is that it's patient. It waits. It hides in success, in celebration, in quiet corners of achievement. And when things slow down, when the noise fades, it steps forward again, reminding you that healing isn't the same as forgetting. One afternoon, I found myself back in my childhood neighborhood. It was supposed to be a drive-by visit, a wave of nostalgia before heading to a meeting across town. But the street pulled me in. The cracked sidewalks, the graffiti on the basketball court, even the broken swing in the park. It all whispered pieces of who I used to be. Without really planning to, I turned down the old street where our house stood. The paint was still chipped. The same dent was in the mailbox. And for a second, I could almost see my younger self sitting on the porch steps, sketchbook in hand, waiting for a ride that never came. I parked and just sat there, engine running, heart tight. I didn't want to go inside. I wasn't sure I even had the right to anymore. But then the door opened, and there she was, my mother, older, slower, holding a bag of groceries and wearing the same expression I remembered. Half tired, half suspicious. She saw the car before she saw me. And when our eyes met, she didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just stared, like I was a ghost she wasn't sure how to greet. I got out slowly, unsure of what I was walking into. "You look different," she said flatly. I didn't respond. What was I supposed to say? Thanks? So do you? The silence stretched between us like a tightrope neither of us wanted to walk. "Why are you here?" She finally asked, her voice smaller than I remembered. "Just passing through," I replied. We stood there awkwardly, like strangers sharing a past neither of us wanted to unpack. She motioned to the front door. "You can come in, if you want." I hesitated. The last time I'd walked through that door, I'd been told I'd never make it, that I was throwing my life away, that dreaming was for fools. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside. The walls hadn't changed. The same crooked photo hung near the light switch. The same couch with worn fabric sat beneath the window. It felt like walking through a museum of a life I no longer belonged to. She set the groceries down and poured herself a cup of tea. "You want one?" she asked. I shook my head. I didn't come for tea. I came for something I didn't even know how to ask for. We sat in silence for a long while. She stirred her tea even though she hadn't added anything to it. "I think it was just something to do with her hands. I see you on TV sometimes," she said finally. "The news. Internet. People say you're doing big things." I nodded, still saying nothing. She looked away. "I didn't think it would turn out like this," she added quietly. That was the closest she ever came to an apology. "No, I'm sorry for calling you useless. No, I regret not believing in you." Just a vague confession wrapped in awkwardness and guilt. I wanted to scream, to stand up and throw every memory back at her like broken glass. I wanted to ask her why she never hugged me when I brought home good grades, why she laughed when I talked about my ideas, why I had to grow up earning love with results instead of receiving it just for being her child. But I didn't say any of that. I just sat there, my hands clenched beneath the table, waiting for the words that never came. Because the truth is, some people don't have it in them to apologize. It's not that they don't feel regret. It's that admitting it out loud would mean confronting everything they've built their identity around. My mother had spent her whole life justifying her harshness as survival. If she admitted she was wrong, if she apologized, then she'd have to face the years she spent pushing me away. And maybe that was too much for her to carry. I used to think that apology would set me free. But sitting there, watching her avoid my gaze, I realized something painful and powerful at the same time. I didn't need it anymore. I stood to leave, brushing off the invisible weight of old memories. "Thanks for the tea," I said, even though I hadn't touched it. She nodded, but didn't walk me to the door. As I stepped outside, I felt lighter, not because anything had been resolved, but because I had finally let go of waiting. I didn't need her words. I didn't need her permission to move forward. I was never going to get the apology. And that was okay, because I had built a life from the ashes of her disbelief, and that was more powerful than any sorry could ever be. There's a certain kind of healing that only happens when you write something with no intention of being read. After my visit to my mother's house, something sat inside me like a stone that wouldn't dissolve, heavy, cold, and silent. I went back to my penthouse, back to my schedule, my calls, my meetings, my facades. But that night, after brushing off 2 calls from my assistant and another from an eager investor, I sat down at my desk, opened a blank document, and started writing. Not an email. Not a speech. A letter. To her. I don't even know what compelled me to do it. Maybe it was everything I couldn't say to her face, or maybe it was the boy inside me still desperate to be heard. Just once. The cursor blinked, waiting. And then, the words came, pouring out faster than I could think, guided more by memory than by choice. I didn't worry about being polished or precise. I just told the truth. The raw, painful, unfiltered truth. Not the kind I rehearsed in interviews, not the inspiring version with perfect endings, but the kind that bleeds. "Dear Mom," I typed. "I'm not writing this for a reply. I'm writing because if I don't get these words out, they'll stay inside me forever, and I've already carried them for too long." I told her how lonely it was growing up in a house full of noise but absent of love. How every compliment I never received became a silent hunger I fed with ambition. I wrote about the science fair, the nights I stayed up coding in secret, the birthdays I spent alone in my room pretending not to care. I described how it felt to be called useless by the one person whose voice had the power to define me. I wrote about the tears she never saw, the ones I let fall only when the lights were out and no one was watching. And then I told her what it did to me, how I stopped expecting kindness, how I learned to measure my worth by output, by wins, by numbers, by praise from strangers, how I became addicted to proving people wrong because it was the only language I knew how to speak. I told her that every business pitch was a performance, every milestone a desperate plea for someone to finally say, "I'm proud of you," and how even when they did, it never filled the hole she left behind. Because the applause of the world is loud, but it never quite drowns out the silence of a mother who never clapped for you. At one point, I paused. My fingers trembled. The screen was blurred by the tears I didn't even realize were forming. I got up, splashed cold water on my face, and came back. But I didn't stop writing. I couldn't. Because the truth kept pulling at me, unraveling a thread that had been knotted for years. I told her that I forgave her, not because she asked, not because she changed, but because I had to. Because holding on to that pain was slowly poisoning everything I had built. And I had finally realized that being free wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about no longer needing to. The letter ended simply. You don't have to respond. You don't even have to read this. But if one day you wonder why I no longer come home, why I stopped calling, why I keep you at a distance, it's not hate. It's protection. I'm finally building a life that doesn't need to be explained or defended. I just hope one day you understand that the version of me you raised didn't break. He just grew up without you. I signed it, folded it digitally, then sat staring at the screen. For a moment, I hovered over the print button, another over email. But I did neither. I closed the document, saved it in a folder titled Unsent, and powered down my laptop. That letter wasn't for her. Not really. It was for me. A moment of honesty between the man I had become and the boy I used to be. A bridge I needed to cross, even if she never met me halfway. That night, I slept deeper than I had in months. It's strange how healing doesn't always arrive with grand gestures or apologies. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in the form of unsent letters, unspoken truths, and the choice to walk away without slamming the door. I woke up the next morning feeling lighter. Not healed, not completely, but lighter. And that was enough. That was the first step. It was a Wednesday. I remember because I had back-to-back meetings lined up from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., and my assistant had already warned me not to add anything else to my schedule. The morning started like most others: coffee, elevator ride, conference calls, and the usual flood of emails. But just before noon, she walked in. No warning, no call, no appointment. My mother. I didn't recognize her at first. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in presence. Her shoulders were hunched slightly, like life had pressed down on her one too many times. She wore the same kind of faded cardigan she always did, the kind that smelled like old fabric softener in time. My assistant was flustered, trying to explain that this woman had insisted on seeing me, that she had waited outside for nearly 2 hours before anyone noticed her. I could have said no. I could have told her to come back with an appointment. But something in me said, let her in. She stepped inside my office slowly, like she was walking into a room that didn't belong to her, and maybe it didn't. I watched her eyes scan the space. The leather chairs, the framed awards, the skyline view. Her gaze lingered on the photograph of me shaking hands with the president of a Fortune 500 company. She didn't smile. She didn't say congratulations. Instead, she looked at me like she was trying to match this man to the boy she once dismissed. I didn't come to fight, she said, her voice dry and quiet. I needed to see you. I gestured for her to sit, even though every nerve in my body was screaming. I hadn't seen her since that awkward afternoon in her kitchen, and even then, we barely spoke. I thought I had buried that version of myself, the version who wanted something from her. But as she sat down, across from me in a room that symbolized everything she said I'd never be, I realized I wasn't as untouchable as I'd convinced myself. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, plain, unsealed, creased at the corners. She slid it across my desk like it weighed more than it looked. I didn't touch it. What is this? I asked. She looked down. Just some things I found while cleaning. Thought you should have them. I opened the envelope slowly, unsure of what to expect. Inside were 3 items: a crumpled piece of paper from my old sketchbook, the first app design I ever showed her, a photo of me at 9 years old, holding a ribbon I won at the school science fair, and a letter, not typed, not polished, handwritten, in her handwriting. I looked up at her, confused. You kept these? She nodded. I threw a lot of things away, but some I didn't. The silence between us stretched and warped, heavy with things unsaid. I wanted to ask her why she had come. Why now? After all the interviews, the wealth, the awards, why today, in my office, surrounded by the life she once said was impossible? I heard your interview last week, she said, answering the question I hadn't yet spoken. The one where they asked about your childhood. I remembered that interview. I had been careful with my words. I didn't name names. I didn't assign blame. But I didn't sugarcoat anything either. I told the truth. The emotional neglect, the ridicule, the silence, all of it. I didn't know you felt that way, she whispered. That struck a nerve. I leaned forward. You didn't know? Mom, you called me a failure before I'd even tried. You mocked everything I cared about. You told relatives I was a waste of time. What part of that didn't scream pain to you? She flinched, not dramatically, but enough to show that the words landed. She looked down at her hands. I was scared, she said. You were chasing something I didn't understand. I wanted you to be safe, stable. I thought if I broke your dreams early, you'd settle for something that wouldn't break you later. I sat back, the wind knocked out of me, not by anger this time, but by understanding. Twisted, painful, imperfect understanding. In her mind, her cruelty was a shield. Misguided love wrapped in fear. That didn't excuse what she did. But it explained why she never saw the damage until it was done. I'm not here to fix anything, she added. I didn't want to leave this life without at least trying to meet the man you've become. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't ready to forgive her either. There's no perfect resolution to this kind of story. No cinematic moment where a mother apologizes and a son embraces her while soft music plays. Sometimes the only closure you get is the kind you give yourself. She stood up, clutching the empty envelope now like it was her only anchor. You don't have to call, she said. I just wanted to see your eyes and know they weren't full of hate. I stood too slowly. I didn't hug her. I didn't shake her hand. But I looked her in the eye and said, they're not full of hate. But they're not full of need either. She nodded. She seemed to understand. As she walked out, I sat back down at my desk, staring at the old sketch she'd returned to me. The paper was creased, torn, but familiar. Like a ghost from a world I'd outgrown but never quite escaped. I slipped it into a new frame and placed it next to my degrees and awards, not because it was the most impressive thing I'd built, but because it was the first. The boy who drew that sketch had been called useless. Today, that sketch sat in the office of a billionaire CEO. And that, to me, was the only apology I ever truly needed. There's something haunting about looking into the eyes of a child who reminds you of who you used to be. Every year, I funded a scholarship for students from underfunded neighborhoods, places where dreams came wrapped in shame and potential was treated like a bad joke. But this year felt different. I had agreed to speak in person, something I rarely did. I wasn't a natural speaker. My power was in building, not performing. But when I stood in front of that small auditorium packed with teenagers in worn uniforms and mismatched shoes, I saw my own younger self in nearly every seat. I didn't walk in with a script. No rehearsed motivational monologue or slick video montage. I walked in carrying the very first sketchbook I ever owned, the one my mother had nearly torn to pieces. I held it in one hand like a trophy, not because it was perfect, but because it survived. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel embarrassed to tell the raw truth. I didn't feel the need to wrap it in business jargon or sugar it up for sponsors. I just told them what it was like to dream in a place where no one believed in you. I told them about the nights I stayed awake with a flashlight under my blanket, watching startup documentaries with stolen Wi-Fi. I told them how I lied to get into tech forums, faked credentials to get in front of investors, and cried in silence when no one saw potential in me. I told them that being called useless didn't kill me. It lit something in me that never stopped burning. And then I said something I had never said out loud before. Every single thing they said disqualified me became the very thing that made me unstoppable. The room went still, because they understood. They knew what it meant to be the kid who gets laughed at for dreaming too big. They knew the weight of being told to be realistic, to lower their expectations, to aim for something safe. But I didn't come to tell them that hard work always wins, because it doesn't. I came to tell them that sometimes you work in the dark for years. Sometimes you build something only to have it ignored, discarded, or stolen. But if you keep going long enough, the same people who called you a fool will call you a genius. I paused and pulled out the letter I wrote but never sent, the one to my mother. I didn't read it out loud. I just held it up and said, "This is proof that healing doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes you write the words you need to hear, and that's enough. A girl in the front row, no older than 15, raised her hand. How did you know when to stop trying to make them proud? She asked. Her voice cracked slightly, but her eyes didn't blink. She meant it. I walked down from the stage and stood in front of her, crouching slightly so we were eye to eye. You don't stop, I said. You just change the direction of your pride. You stop aiming it at them, and you start aiming it at the mirror. She nodded slowly, but I could see the question still swirling in her mind. And I knew what it was. I had asked it myself for years. Why didn't they love me the way I needed to be loved? I looked back at the room, full of young minds balancing hope with hesitation. Then I said something I had never rehearsed but felt more real than anything I'd ever spoken. Some of us weren't born into encouragement. We were born into silence, disappointment, or neglect. But that doesn't mean we were born broken. It means we were born into a harder battle, one we can still win. The auditorium erupted in quiet applause. Not the kind you get at business expos or award galas, but the kind that feels like acknowledgement. Not just of success, but of survival, of resilience, of finally being seen. After the talk, some of the kids came up to me. A few asked questions about my company. Others just stood there awkwardly, like they didn't know how to say thank you. One boy, probably no older than 13, handed me a folded piece of paper. This is my idea, he whispered. You don't have to read it now, but... I didn't want to hide it anymore. I took the paper with both hands, the way a soldier takes a flag. Carefully, reverently. I saw myself in that boy, and I realized then that maybe the apology I never got was never meant to come from my mother. Maybe it came from the universe, through these kids, by letting me become the person I had needed when I was their age. As I left the building, the sun was just beginning to set. The city buzzed around me like it always did. But inside me, something had changed. The pain hadn't disappeared. The past hadn't rewritten itself. But for the first time, it felt like I had done more than just survive it. I had turned it into something that gave other people a reason to keep going. And maybe that was the real reason I had made it this far. I never marked the day on my calendar. There was no special event, no grand ceremony, no aha moment that told me this was it. But I remember the feeling. It came quietly, like a fog lifting. I was sitting in my office, same corner chair, same view of the city skyline, a view that once symbolized everything I was chasing. And I realized I didn't feel the need to chase anymore. Not my past, not their approval, not even the apology I once believed would heal me. For the first time, I was content, not ecstatic, not numb, just at peace. That day started like any other. I had a meeting with our product team in the morning, a strategy session before lunch, and a dinner scheduled with a group of international investors. But somewhere between those moments, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in the executive bathroom, not adjusting my tie, not straightening my blazer, just looking. Not at my success, not at my image, but at myself. Really looking. And what I saw staring back was no longer the boy who needed to prove anything to anyone. He was gone, not erased, just grown. I saw the lines around my eyes, formed not just from stress, but from laughter too. I saw the weariness in my shoulders from years of building, climbing, pushing. But more than anything, I saw stillness in my gaze. That deep, grounded kind of stillness that only comes from finally putting your past down and choosing not to carry it anymore. I didn't even realize how heavy it was until I let it go. I went back to my desk and opened a file on my laptop titled Unsent. Inside were dozens of documents, letters, journals, confessions. Most were written to people who would never read them. My mother, former teachers, childhood friends who vanished when the spotlight found me. I had spent years documenting my hurt, as if turning it into words would keep it from turning into bitterness. And maybe it worked. But as I scrolled through the titles, I realized something strange. None of them felt relevant anymore. They were still true, still part of me, but they didn't own me anymore. That afternoon, I walked into my assistant's office and told her to cancel everything for the rest of the day. She stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Are you okay?" she asked. I smiled, really smiled, and said, "Yeah, I'm just done chasing ghosts." Then I walked out, took the elevator to the ground floor, and stepped into the world without a plan. I didn't go to a restaurant. I didn't retreat to some exclusive club or private suite. I went to the park, the one I used to pass every day on my way to the library. I sat on a bench and watched kids run across the grass, their parents cheering them on with smiles I used to envy. A young boy fell, scraped his knee, and cried. His mother rushed over, knelt beside him, and whispered something that made him laugh through the tears. And that's when it hit me. I spent my whole life trying to become something because I lacked what that boy had in that moment. Comfort, assurance, presence, a voice that said, "You matter, even when you fall." I never got that, but I had become it. Not just for the kids in those classrooms or the teams in my company, but for myself. I stayed on that bench until the sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and lavender. Then I pulled out my phone and opened my contact list. For a brief moment, my thumb hovered over my mother's name. We hadn't spoken since the day she showed up at my office. I didn't hate her. Not anymore. I just didn't need anything from her. And that was freedom. Instead of calling her, I deleted the letter I wrote but never sent. Not out of anger. Out of release. That night, I stood on my balcony, looking out over the glowing city I used to see as a finish line. But now I knew. It was never about the view. It was about the climb. And now that I'd reached this place, not just in status, but in soul, I understood something I never did before. Sometimes the real success isn't being applauded. It's no longer needing the applause. I turned off my phone, stepped back inside, and made dinner for myself. Just me. No staff, no catering, no guests. Just a quiet meal in a quiet room, cooked by the same hands that once trembled writing code in a dark corner of a rented apartment. That was the day I stopped looking back. Not because I had forgotten, but because I had finally arrived. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of your own journey from silence to strength, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more powerful stories that prove pain can become purpose. And in the comments, tell us, what dream did they say you'd never reach, and how far have you come since then? Your voice matters here.